Why is Mithilesh not here? I wonder.
Ma'am, I'm here.
Then
Good
please
afternoon.
begin now. Yeah.
Yes, ma'am. So I think so, ma'am, we can wait for 2 more minutes so that others can join, and then we'll start our session. Is it okay?
Yeah. Is it okay with Shobha?
Yeah. We can. No problem.
Okay.
Thank you, ma'am.
And the YouTube live link has been sent. Then I can share it on other groups.
Just give me a minute. I will share.
Yeah.
So, ma'am, should we begin?
Yes. Let's begin with the introductions.
Okay. Hello, ma'am. Good morning, everyone. Those who has joined us today. Um, I'm so sorry. It's afternoon. So, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mithilesh Mishra, and I welcome you all in our today's webinar on powerful dialogue. And today with us, we are having our guest, a well-known psychologist, Mrs. Shobha Managoli. I'm honored to introduce ma'am today in our webinar. So, ma'am is the conceptualizer of powerful dialogue, head of parenting practices at Parent of, and mentor at Millen Global. Ma'am has also practiced as a clinical psychology in psychology field for more than 30 years. In her practice, she adopts a holistic therapeutic approach to address social, emotional, and behavioral issues of her clients. Population she has worked with are pediatric to geriatric, slums to boardrooms, and rural to urban areas. She continued to train, mentor, and coach budding psychologists and caregivers at the local, national, and international level. In terms of ma'am's experience is tremendous, but still with few numbers, I would like to introduce her experience in psychology field. So, ma'am has more than 30 plus years of experience in training, and 288 mental health experts has been trained under ma'am. 75,600 hours of therapy she has taken in the field of psychology and therapy. 18,000 hours of training experiences ma'am is having. 90 plus trainings has been trained under ma'am. So it's a really a great number. And she has given 5 training manuals. And none the least, uh, I request those who are joining us kindly mute yourself so that we can have smooth webinar. Okay, I'm so sorry to interrupt. So 450 training manuals and many more contributions ma'am has given in the field of psychology. So dear ma'am, we are pleased to invite you and honored to have you with us in our today's webinar, and we are looking forward to have a great webinar today. And welcome you, ma'am.
Thank you
So
so much, Mithilesh.
thank you, ma'am. I would also like to welcome our co-founder of Silence, Mrs. Sudipta Roy. She is the licensed clinical psychologist, and till now she is working in the field of clinical psychology with various populations. I welcome you, ma'am.
Thank you. Thank you, Mithilesh.
I would like to hand over our today's webinar, and you can take it ahead. Thank you so much, ma'am.
Thank you, Mithilesh. So, what an introduction to to Shobha ma'am. It's been, look at the experience, the range and depth of work done. It's really tremendous. I'm very proud to have you here with us, Shobha. And we know that you have authored this wonderful book called Powerful Dialogues. And it is on a very burning topic, which actually looks at mentorship in the field of mental health from a very indigenized perspective. And I think that's the reason why we would really like to hear from you about your book, your views on this field, and maybe you could share some of your rich experiences with us today. So, to begin with, Shobha ma'am, I would like to place very, a point of curiosity from my side that how did you end up conceptualizing this book, Powerful Dialogues? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, thanks, Sudipta, for the kind words. Yes, definitely, I would like to share my thoughts on that, and would like to probably share it as a journey. I think, yeah. So I think it's very interesting for me to share, and every time I share my journey of writing, since this is my maiden book, also my first book, and as they always say, that whatever you do first remains in your heart or for a very, very long time. Powerful Dialogue is one of those things that stays with me and will stay with me for a very long time, because this is my maiden uh, thing of writing the book. But I think this book evolved itself organically. This was not a book that I had initially conceptualized to write. But I think the journey of writing this book started very, very interestingly. That I had a mentee with whom I used to work. He's a corporate trainer himself, and he does a lot of trainings for different strategist, entrepreneur, and does many other work. And one day we were just sitting and talking, and he just said that, Shobha, I think you should write a book, and the book should be called Powerful Dialogues, because every time I meet you, I find something powerful that I take back, and when I go back, I think it was always a dialogue. I actually just joked. I said, like, you know what? We are mental health professionals. Trust me, all of us have been trained to give talk in words that can impact others' life. And hence, there is no, so calling it powerful dialogue and trying to, create a mysticism around that is not something that I feel is right for me to do. And this was 2011. The book was published in 2019. So it has taken 7 to 8 long years for this book to come out. That was the first part. But later, in some other conversation, I was talking to a few other, and one of them was my mentee, who initially had come to me as a client. And as we started this journey, I just mentioned to her in one of the conversation that, you know what, there is a, this is what has somebody told me, and this is what this person said about me, and I should write this book and all. And I think people just think we should write books. But then she said, no, Shobha, I think it is important that you should write the book, because I have been to many counselors, psychologists before. And I've had my experiences with them, and I have found some changes, behavioral changes. My family has been happy. But when I came to you, I had a journey of transformation. And I know it happened through all the different dialogues that we have had with each other. I think you should write. And it was at this point of time that it struck me very strongly that, oh, there is a need for something like that. Because if somebody is coming back and saying that I've been to different counselors and therapists and I've found only change but not transformation, then that is something to be considered, and hence the need for a book. But then I thought, what would I write? And then I started going and reflecting on myself and going into a complete detail of saying, uh, what are the dialogues that have affected my life? How have they impacted me? Who are these people? What was the context of this dialogue? And when I went into my journey inside, I Definitely, there were many dialogues from my teachers, from my parents, from my friends that have impacted my life significantly. When I started chronicling and journaling them and putting them into a format, I also started interviewing all my clients to say what was it in the session that brought change in them and what was the point of transformation for them. And when we started interviewing all our clients, it started becoming very evident that there is something much more profound and deeper that is happening in the dynamics of a mentor and a mentee relationship, of a therapist and a client relationship. Then I asked a lot of my friends and other people that what were the dialogues that impacted their life and made transformation in them. And there were many who started sharing of things that their parents have said, of things that their teachers have said, of things that their friends have said, or quotes that they have read and that have left lasting impact on their lives. So when I got all these three, perspectives, and we chronicled and journaled them in detail, there was like a dearth of information that was available. And honestly, it was chaotic. And at that point of time, I personally was very confused. Where will it go? But there was one thing that I was very clear of, that this book will be a non-fiction book, but in a narrative style. Because in non-fiction, most of the time, it's very, very preachy language. I didn't want it to be preachy language. I wanted it to be a smooth flowing narrative that would play the game. So I said, great. And this, but I was not able to do. And that's when I looked out for an editor. I got an amazing editor called Shubha Shrikant. And then we both started working together. And it is in those multiple discussions that we had, the conceptualization of the book came. And then we realized that all these narratives can actually be grouped under different context. And the context of this grouping could be uh, uh, different themes or the purpose of what happens when a dialogue happens. And we conceptualize this in terms of, the different themes that we came about. And as we conceptualize these themes, I'm extremely sorry, there seems to be some reason that I cannot go down on my slides. So I have to kind of, go out of the PPT and come back. So sorry about that. But what happened actually was that when we started looking at all the dialogues and all the situations under which transformation have happened in the life of the people, these 5 themes emerged very, very strongly. And these 5 themes ultimately became the pillar or the cornerstone in which we wrote the book in its narrative form. In the book, the flow is very, very different. It starts with challenge, goes to clarity, empathy, trust, and defining self. But what exactly it meant was that every dialogue that happens, there is an underlying purpose in the dialogue, and there's an underlying reason which is in the mind of the sender, but then that is experienced in the receiver. So it's a little complex part to understand that this is something that's sent from the sender with an intent, but it's actually experienced by the receiver, and hence powerful dialogue gains its power only when the receiver experiences it. I am saying this because we are a group of mental health professionals here, and it is important for us to understand that irrespective of what we do, it's only when our client or the receiver experience is when the transformation or the change can happen. So this was how the whole powerful dialogue as a book emerged. Once this whole clarity came, it was just a matter of fact, and within so that's the gist of this book, which is a collection of all the experiences that we have had. I've had, my clients have had with me, and people have had in their lives that have been put together in a form that is easier to understand, and a model of powerful dialogue emerged, and a framework for each of the theme also started emerging. And that's how this book took shape. So that is the journey of powerful dialogue and the book itself. Thank you.
Yeah, that sounds amazing. The whole journey that you had and how it came up into a book. And I think that one thing that kind of strikes me is that maybe our viewers or audience might want to hear about a single experience and how that becomes a powerful dialogue leading to a transformation. So do you think you could share anything in your life or one of your mentees which kind of led to a transformation in their life, and what we really mean by that transformation? Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for asking that. I think I would like to share not necessarily one, but two. The reason being, I want to share one which is personal, and I want to share one which is with my mentee. So I'll go with my mentee first.
Yes.
So as Mithilesh was, introducing me, she said that I have personally trained many psychologists, and that was one passion I had, and I will continue to have, is wanting to groom and wanting to, mentor mental health professional, the budding mental health professional. So there was this one psychologist that I was supervising for the client. She was working in a school, and one day evening, during her time, she just called off out of the blue, which was not her scheduled, appointment with me. And she started blabbering, ma'am, this is the case, this is happening, this is happening. I don't know, I don't understand what is happening. This person is saying like this. She went on and on and on and on. And the way she spoke, uh, it sounded like a layman, lot of judgments, lot of opinion about the person. Man, this is very irritating person, ma'am. He's doing like this, ma'am. That mother is saying like this, but it is not making sense, ma'am. And you know what, ma'am? They are horrible people, ma'am. They are doing this to the child. And it went on and on and on for a very long time. I listened for 2 to 3 minutes, and then I just stopped and said, wait, I don't hear a psychologist speaking. That's it. I just made that one statement at that point of time. And then she suddenly said, okay. And she said, ma'am, I will call you back. And she cut the call. I said, fair enough, because I was aware of what I was doing. Next day morning, she called up, and then there was a proper description of the client's journey. She said, ma'am, this is a 14-year-old boy who came to me with this problem, and his parents were having this, and there is marital disharmony, and there is some amount of domestic violence, and then the father is dominating, and then the mother is depressed, and this boy is behaving, and then it went smooth. I heard the whole client story, and then I journey, and then I gave her whatever tips and techniques and whatever her plan should have been, and discussed. We went into the supervisory model and spoke to her. After the whole thing was over, then she asked me and I asked her what happened. And then she said that when you said, I do not hear a psychologist speaking, it hit me like a thud. And I reflected on what I said in the night. And then I realized that, actually, I have started becoming dependent on you. For me, if I'm stuck with a problem, call up ma'am, take her inputs, and then, just go forward, do the work, and then, get a name for that. And that was the point of transformation. From where on, she started describing the clients, understanding the client's journey. She did a lot of research on that particular diagnosis that she was working with for the client, and then came back and just came for getting things clarified and started the transformation. So when I say transformation, it is a complete shift in your perspective. It's a complete shift in your vision of what you want to do and how you want to do things. And today she is one of the leading school psychologists in Bangalore, works with schools, and has a really good reputation for herself for being able to handle complex challenges within the school system. This is about one of my mentees where she got this clarity and was able to push and challenge herself to do things better. This particular thing is also. The other one, which was very, very interesting, which I would like to share about me. I came to Bangalore in 1997 to start practicing. And I was talking to one of my professors, and I was saying, like, I'm very unclear what I should be doing. Should I work with schizophrenics because I was doing social skills training for them, or should I go with, de-addiction and work with alcoholics? But you know what? It's very interesting because I was at that point of time working with KSRTC, and I was like, is it important that I continue with my trainings? I'm enjoying doing this parenting workshop. So I was like little all over the place and discussing it with my professor, saying, what should I be doing? And I'm so confused. Or I feel I should be doing everything. So it was like, should I do everything, or should I just narrow myself to one and become an expert of that? And my professor just said one thing: Shobha, with your passion and energy, you should try to reach unreached. And that defined my professional calmed, because it just made so much sense that instead of saying that should I work with alcoholics, or should I work with this target group, should I work with that target group, should I do training, should I do, the thousands of questions that were racing in my mind just stopped. And it made more sense when he said, reach the unreached. Today, I extend this scenario by saying, reach the unreached through the reached. And when this basic redefining of my own professional self happened for me, then what came out for me was that, okay, I could do. And from there, I started looking at opportunities of trying to reach for the unreached. I was blessed with getting projects where I could work with slum people. I could work with, I could work in boardrooms of Fortune 500 companies. I could work in the rural areas. I could work in urban areas. Then I could work with pediatric population to geriatric population. It just opened a realm of opportunities for me because I just made the shift that instead of saying, should I do this? I just said, what is it that I need to give to society? And what I need to give is to try to reach out with my competence and my skills to the unreached population. I think today's webinar itself also, I would not have been addressing all of you if I have not decided to reach the unreached, because you are also the unreached. Because there was no way, being a freelancer, private practitioner, currently heading a tech company, creating a work between psychology and technology, which is my latest passion. I don't think I would have been able to reach out to mental health professionals in this manner. And this defines how your professional boundaries can expand if you make a shift into your internal definition of your professional self. So this is how, what I mean when I say transformation that happens in the complete shift in paradigm perspective, and the results are there for all to see. So that is what I mean when I say transformation, and with these two examples. And the book obviously covers many such anecdotes and incidences that I have had in the life of people as well.
Yes, yes. So I think that sounds so much like, many times the transition from childhood or adolescence to adulthood, like, when you are actually a rebel, you're blaming things and, criticizing things around you. And then when you make the transition to adulthood, you realize it's your responsibility, it's your journey, and this is what you have to do. So I think that sounds, yeah, it sounds very interesting to me. So in the straight line, I mean, in the line of that, I would like you to comment on how do you think about the mentor-mentee relationship in the context of psychotherapy?
Got it. 1 second. Yeah. I think it's very important to understand this, that in a psychotherapeutic relationship, the mentor and mentee relationship has multiple shades and multiple hues going forward, because it's a relationship of transformation. And I would like here to emphasize that it's a relationship of transformation at both the ends, not at one end. And I think that's what the most important thing. Most of the time when people come to me for internships, they say, ma'am, we want to learn how you do things. We want to learn, if I have an ADHD child, tell me what should I do with this ADHD child now? Okay, so uh, those are the questions. But I would like, especially the mentors, all the mentors in this group, to be aware that when a mentee comes to you, the mentee comes, like we always say, what is first presented is the symptom, but what is underlying is much more deeper. And what we need to work on the mentor-mentee relationship is improving or enhancing the mentee's own definition of why he or she decided to get into this profession, working with what makes them click to do this something, and how we can then be a co-traveler in that journey. And what happens when we take this approach of being a co-traveler in the journey of our mentees, that we also from inside start transforming, because they also start bringing valuable inputs to our own thing. So just to share a small example in this equation. So though there is a lot of sharing of what I call as a technical knowledge, which is the tips and the techniques, how does a behavior therapeutic, should you be using differential reinforcement versus graduated exposure? Should you be doing CBT? Should you be using what kind of CBT? Is it REBT, or are you going for psychoanalysis? What is the analytical process? Yes, these are all technical journeys. But deep inside, what are you also doing is, as a mentor and mentee relationship, that you're listening to the experiences, because the mentee brings in clients or brings in experiences that probably we have not had. And hence, working with that issues, working with those challenges with the mentee takes the relationship at a very, very different transformation level. So just let me share one small thing. I have worked, you see that I have worked with different, but one of the areas that I have not extensively worked has been the areas of sexuality, femininity, defining masculinity in relationships or even in this. And one of my mentee, actually, in one of the conversations that we were having, and we were talking about something, she just looked at me and said, "I think this is a feministic viewpoint that you bring forward." And I was shocked. Explored areas that I need to really look into and see how is it my uh, orientation in my sexuality in terms of my being feminist or my being non-feminist coming into my sessions. And it again opened up a different world for me, where later on, when I worked on this a little later, and then I extensively got into marital therapy and marital disharmony cases, typically couples seeking support just before they want to take the plunge, saying that, we would file for a divorce and go for the legal processes. I had one of the male clients telling me that you are gender neutral. Now, this journey between the mentee saying this and me being experienced by my marital therapy clients, as especially the male members, as being gender neutral, not aligning with anything, for me was a point of self-contentment, not an achievement, but a point of self-contentment, because then it transformed at both the level. Now, this mentee of mine who brought this to my notice is now currently planning to do lot of analytical work with LGBT and queer communities, and is talking to LGBTQ community, one particular person whom I had introduced her to figure out how mental health issues, what are the mental health issues they have, but most important, a very powerful insight to me, saying that, ma'am, they do not seek help because they feel that even the mental health professionals look at them from that pure view that the society looks at them, and that transition has not happened. So they seem to be unwilling or uncomfortable. So whereas in the general population, when we talk overall population, we talk about stigma for mental health services, in the queer and LGBT community, there is a whole resistance because they don't trust the mental health professional and find it difficult. So we have people who actually evaluate mental health professionals, that are they suitable to work with LGBT communities. And I've interacted with one of such person, and she interviewed me at length before she could refer people who had these issues, and how I could work with them in terms of their whole being. So mentor-mentee relationship is a very powerful relationship. In the early stages of the psychotherapeutic relationship of mentor-mentee relationship, mentee learns a lot. But if the relationship matures over a period of time, maybe 6 months to a year, the mentor also starts transforming, and we should be open to it.
I think that's beautifully put, Shobha. I actually, very somewhere in the middle of my clinical experience, I started noticing that somehow the mentee and the mentor relationship goes parallelly. Like, there is a growth happening in the mentee, and at the same time, the mentor is also growing. So I came across a book at writing also, and it talks exactly about this, like, that there's no transformation that can occur in the client or in any mentee unless they
Yes,
already had the seed of that. And as the mentee
with the
grows,
mentor.
it's also the mentor who's growing. And so it's like, it cannot happen one without the other, and it's a parallel growth that's happening. And many
Yes,
times we clinicians would find that when we have a burning query in our mind, and a need to grow to that level of something, the universe kind of sends you all those clients who need to resolve the same issue in their life. And somehow you kind of help them to resolve that issue, and you also grow and you find your own answers to your problems in your life. Yeah. Would you
Yes.
agree with that, Shobha?
Yes, I definitely would agree with you. Um, when I was struggling with relationship issues, I had a lot of marital. I had a lot of clients with marital issues coming. I am single, and when I say I was struggling with relationship, because there were multiple relationship issues that I was struggling in terms of my relationship with family, how society looked at me because I was single and decided to be single, and how I was the odd man out in family functions because I didn't have a partner with me, a husband standing next to me, and so I was not part of all the couple jokes. And I was when I was struggling with these different dynamics in my own life on relationships, I had maximum number of marital therapy cases and live-in relationship cases, couple therapies that were coming out to me, and settling parent talking about their relationship with their children, the odd man out, a lot of introverts coming to me saying we are odd in social situations. So Sudipta, you're 200% correct that when we experience something, the universe does play. And I think the Alchemist book explains it much better than any other book. I have always felt that. But that is true. There are many theories that go, and one of the theories that go about is uh, what do you call law of attraction. So one of the books that one of the theories that go is the law of attraction, that what you feel is what you attract, what you sense is what. But please understand, analyzing at every level, that today I have this number of clients and hence this is my challenge, my issue, my area to explore. The vice versa should not be done. I have seen some of my mentees doing that, and I've seen their struggle, and it has become a challenge with them. So please do not go on a, because we are staying in a tech world, we are all into this logic, algorithms, uh, we are all into this analytics. So it's like, okay, I have seen 20 clients or 60 clients or 100 clients in the last 3 months, and the trend of the clients has been this. So I think this is my issue. Please do not try to get your themes or patterns from this analysis.
Yes,
But
yes, yes.
yes, yes, it is
Absolutely,
important.
absolutely.
Yes, Sudipta, because it's equally important that the theme or the pattern, the awareness should come from inside you suddenly, either in your meditation, morning walk. They say toilet seats are better to get such insights into self. But wherever it comes, it needs to come from within, and it should not be through logic. It needs to be through your experience or through your like an inner voice that tells you something about yourself. So I believe that is something that we need to be aware of. Yeah.
Okay, so that thank you for bringing in the pitfalls of that, that kind of that line of thinking, which people might take a little too far sometimes. Yes.
Yes.
And now let me continue with my interviewing, and I'm enjoying this talk so much, so I'd really like you to share so many more insights, I feel.
Mm,
One is it from the point of view of a mentee,
mm,
what should be some of the criteria that they keep in mind when they are selecting a mentor?
mm. Okay.
Yeah. Or let's do with both ways, like, mentor selecting the mentee and a mentee select.
Okay, so I think since in my flow, I have just put the choosing a mentee as the first slide. I think we'll just go with that.
Okay.
Uh, yeah, so it just allow technology at times to guide you, kind of a thing,
Yeah.
not necessarily all the time. I think one of the biggest challenge many of us as mentors always have had is, how do I choose my mentee? How do I decide? And this is something when I have dealt with so many, and I am talking about choosing a mentee, or I'm talking about being a supervisor to say I would supervise this, not because you're in an institutional setting. So, like if you're in an institutional setting, like from where me and Sudipta are alumnus of NIMHANS, then, and if you're a part of that, then by default you are mentoring, or you are guiding, you're teaching, you're facilitating whatever you are doing for the students, and then even if you leave the institution, you go back for something, and your teachers do rise up to the occasion and give you inputs and do mentor you. I am not talking, I'm talking about when somebody approaches you because of your expertise, because of your experience, somebody who sees within you that you have the authority to do something. Now, many times people come and say, ma'am, we know you're working with life skills. Can you teach us life skills? Now, when people come forward to do something like this, then it becomes very, very interesting and important for us to, how do I make a choice of my mentee? I have made many mistakes in choosing my mentee. Some of my mentees have been obviously very, uh, I would say, rude. Some of my mentees have gained whatever they want to gain, but then they have like I say wash their hands off. They don't even want to acknowledge or recognize me if we meet in some either seminars or conference, or even for that matter give a call to each other or something. So we have different people who behave differently. But over the years, what I have realized is uh, there are some things that we need to look into when we are choosing a mentee. And these are the 5 things that I've found very, very useful for me when I'm choosing my mentee. And today I have become very, I would not say finicky, but very choosy when I do. And I do certain things to say whether I would be choosing this person to be my mentee, because it is important for me that the journey that both of us have should be beneficial to both of us and not. So when my mentee is unhappy, even I am unhappy, and I don't want that kind of a thing at this point of time. So first thing, I think it's very, very important that the mentee should very clearly articulate his or her intent to be a mentor and accept you as a mentor. They have to very clearly and specifically say that either it's explicitly or implicitly that I accept you as a mentor. There are different ways that they can say this to you. But just saying that I know you're working with life skills, I want to become a life skills trainer, will you train me? Then that is training, that is not mentoring. But at the same time, if you want to, if they come and say you that I would like to learn how you do things, I want to be with you, I want to go along in this journey. And when they make certain statements that you can identify, then I think that is one of the very, very simple reason for choosing that person as your mentee, even if it means that the person may seem less competent. Second most important thing is the motivation. This is one of the biggest challenge I'm facing, and I've spoken to a few professors in the universities of psychology department, is the motivation to learn and improve. It looks like a lot of youngsters do not want to go through the rigor of training, the rigor of mentorship, the rigor of self-reflection and transformation. And sometimes you have to literally push them to seek help. Now, if you have to push a mentee to seek help, then that is not a mentor-mentee relationship, because the mentee needs to be motivated, and only then you can. So if you have, by default, once somebody who has come to you is unmotivated in their own minds to go through the journey, then either work on motivating them and then go to challenging them as a mentor. Third thing is, as I said, they should be open to being challenged, and they should be action oriented. Many times I've seen, like as simple as active listening skill, one of the key characteristics of an effective therapist, counselor, trainer, healer, whatever you call your role of helping people, or even a manager. A lot of people, when we work on active listening skills, they say, yes, yes, ma'am, we will listen, ma'am, hear you, whatever you're saying. But they won't allow us to even complete our sentences. They're not listening. I'm currently working with one such person who refuses to listen, who refuses to acknowledge that there is something that I need to listen, learn, implement, experiment, come back and discuss, because that is the journey, because she's so fresh. She's just 1.5 years into the system and refuses to listen. So when we have mentees like this, it becomes even more tougher. So it is important to understand that your mentee should be ready to be action oriented rather than just come to you because you're preachy. So when you get, so I usually try and do a preachy session and see how many of them have got bored. If they've got bored, that is my mentee, because I don't want them to go into being uh, happy with my preachiness, but I want them to go towards action. The next is readiness. Mentees have different stages in their life or career. And when they're ready to take on and mature enough to take on, they take on the challenge. So you need to assess the readiness of the mentee to be action oriented and motivated. But I think the most important thing is that there needs to be, they should feel a need for change. What do I mean by that? When you're working in this field for 3 years, 5 years, there comes a stage when you reach a plateau, where you feel stuck, where you feel stagnated. One of the common observations that I'm having about many psychologists coming out, and I've spoken to more than I have trained, you know what they do? They go and become teachers because it's less and there is a burnout. So they either go and become teachers in school and become the most popular teacher counselor in schools, and they become popular, get popular teacher award. Nothing wrong in that. Or they just shift and become psychology lecturers in colleges, because now at PUC level also there is a course that comes for psychology. There's a subject. So they become psychology teachers. Or they completely shift their field and go somewhere else. Vice versa, we have people coming from other fields, stagnated and plateaued into the field of psychology and counseling. So there is this cross thing that has happened, that a person competent, conceptually good in psychology is going and doing something else, but somebody completely different is coming to the field of psychology. Now this happens because you reach plateau, you become complacent, you become, burnout, and you become dependent, and that's when you need. Especially when people come with a complacent attitude and show dependency on the mentor, for me, that is my mentee. Because that is the mentee that would be more than willing to go to the next level, and you can actually work with that mentee to make the breakthrough in the life of the mentee, and vis-a-vis experiencing breakthrough or transformation in your own life. So clearly articulated intent, motivation, action-orientedness, readiness, and a need for change are, according to me, the 5 key factors that should be considered in choosing of a mentee. The second thing that I would like to express, many times mentees come to you with these 6 major challenges. Choose them, because if they're ready to work with you. Number 1 is ego. I've been there, done that, especially talk to a psychologist who just 3 to 4 years or 5 years, up to 7 to 8 years, I would say. The young psychiatrist, psychologist, mental health professional, let's put it across, social workers. And they have not ego as we look at from a psychoanalytic perspective, but from like the ahankara, been there, done that, seen that, it's fine. You know what, new ma'am, you know what, this is the problem, this is what it is, the ABC analysis has been done, this is the antecedent, this is the behavior, this is what I will do, this is the consequent result, ma'am, it is sorted. Till they face a client or a set of clients where they are unable to handle. Second is when your mentees come with a lot of social stereotypes of what needs to be done and what need not be done. Then they are the people you need to work with. This is the next one is a very, very catch-22 situation when they come with limited knowledge and are unwilling to read and learn. Then they come with a lot of prejudices. You know, ma'am, all these ADHD children, no, ma'am, just be strict and just do this, ma'am. Do this 2 behavioral techniques and they are sorted, ma'am. I have done this enough, ma'am. And you know, see, ma'am, these are the results. Why are you telling us to do all these other things, ma'am? Why are you asking me to talk to the parent, ma'am? Prejudices running high. The next is closed mindset. Ma'am, you know what? All this screen addiction or all this LGBT, useless, ma'am. There is nothing like that. I know I've read all these things, but ma'am, I don't believe in these things. And some of the mentees who themselves have a huge amount of repression that they have taken to themselves, and they repress a lot of their own things. I had an interesting analysis. I think a few years back, I did a whole supervision for Bangalore University's group of students. I don't want to name the year. And I had around 20 students coming to me for supervision and training from industrial psychology and clinical psychology. And out of the 25 things, 5 students, when we started working and I started interacting with them, 5 of the students had history of sexual abuse in their lives. Please understand, we come from the same society from where we get our clients, which means our mentees, mental health profession also come from the same society from where we are getting clients. They can also have similar experiences like many of our clients. They can also have traumas in their life. And sometimes it's important to understand. And actually these 5 students that I worked at that point of time, and I, in private told them that I feel that my hypothesis about you is this, and I feel this is the area that you need to work on for yourself. 3 of them agreed to work on it. And then today they are again successful psychologists in their own way, because they've been able to cross the boundary of their repression and come up and work with their trauma, and now help other people work with their trauma. So I think choosing a mentee, these are the 6 and 5, 11 things that I consider when I'm interviewing them before I decide to take them up for my mentorship. So I think this is, for me, the framework that I follow in choosing a mentee.
Yeah.
So I think, Sudipta, I'll go for how to choose a mentor.
Yes, please do.
Thank you. Yeah, I don't know why this is happening. Usually doesn't happen, but yeah. Yeah. Now, all those who are here, how will you choose a mentor? Now, I have always told people that when you want to choose a mentor, these are the 3 things that you should look forward in a mentor. And these are 3 things that I have looked forward in my mentors. I have had many mentors along the way. So it's not like when I'm talking about mentorship and my mentees, I have not been mentored. I have been on both sides of the table. I underwent, and I'm sharing this not because of anything else, but I want sharing this because these are the experiences that I have used in my life to be where I want to be. So I underwent 5 years of psychoanalysis with one group that I worked with, and I had different mentors at different points of time, and I had amazing insights from them. Obviously, the mentors were chosen based on the authority of the subject, the technical background knowledge, blah, blah, blah. Those basic things were obviously. But what was important for me was that they had the competence to handle me. So when you're choosing a mentor, you need to resonate with the mentor and find the mentor to be able to competently handle you as a person. I have been, I think, to most of my mentors, a very tough mentee because I question a lot. I'm very stubborn. I'm aware of a lot of my styles, and those styles have worked in good stead for me. So I use them very often. So competence and yes, passion and genuineness for work is definitely another thing. Sudipta, completely agree with you. Secondly, sincerity.
Yes.
The mentor needs to be sincere. I've had people who have come back and said, you know, ma'am, I enrolled for this mentorship, but the mentor doesn't give me time. He's so high-handed. He says, okay, come at this time. I'm not free at this time. What is this? What are you bringing? So there is no sincerity, because if you have entered into a relationship, you have entered into a relationship, and the sincerity of the relationship and the sacredness of the relationship needs to be maintained. So look at your mentees being sincere to you. You may not find changes immediately, but it is important that your mentee is sincere, because only then the journey can continue. If they have too much of fluctuations, if they're dealing with you, you will have issues. And the final thing is reliability. At no point of time, even if 2 good friends have come to me, and I'm talking reliability from the perspective of confidentiality, when 2 good friends would have come to me for mentoring for different purposes, the other would not know what is happening with this person. The reliability, the ability to keep things confidential, the reliability that I can share anything with my mentor, and my mentor will not look down upon me, but will actually guide me and facilitate my journey so that I can deal with the concern I am bringing forward. So just to share, I'm currently working with one doctor who wants to become a psychiatrist going forward. And currently she has taken a break due to some family things, and she's completed her MBBS, but wants to and studying for her MD and preparing for that exam and all. And she has, I've started few sessions with her, and now and in the session, what came out very, very clearly was her childhood trauma of being abused and issues around sexuality. It came out in a different context that we were working with, and I somehow felt she had, but I did not push her. And now she comes back and says, because she feels trusted and she feels that she could rely on me, that I can help her to overcome this trauma that she's gone through that she's gone through in childhood. So when you're choosing a mentor, and when you authorize a person as being your mentor, and you have articulated your intent that I want you to be my mentor, look for competency, look for sincerity, look for reliability, passion, and genuineness of the work that they are doing. When you put all of these things together, and please understand, none of these things have a checklist, a behavioral interviewing pattern. It is all about how you connect to that person, and this is how you the image of that person is there in your mind. So it is not about a checklist or questionnaire that you need to ask the mentor to fill in for you or for the mentee to be filled in, but it's in the interview. Beyond whatever you are doing the interview for, can you also look at some of these areas and have your own understanding and probably judgment and opinion on this, and then decide to choose how to go forward with the mentorship relationship. So this is basically how you go forward choosing your uh, uh, mentor in the long run. Yes, Sudipta.
So it seems to me like just like in a psychotherapy, the therapeutic alliance is a very sacred one, and that is what holds the entire therapy together. So in the same way, I think the mentor and mentee relationship also is something that goes beyond words, and that's what it's a very subtle and important part of the entire process of mentoring, I think. Right?
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yes. So I think in your book, Shobha, one of the things that I really loved reading about was your conceptualization of how to build up empathy in mentees.
Yeah.
So I want you to talk a little bit about that because it's such an important part of even all our mental health practice. The building of empathy is so important. Yeah.
Yeah, it's very interesting to understand empathy. Okay, uh, I think I remember reading the word empathy, BA first year psychology. What are the characteristics of a good psychologist? We all start, the word empathy comes into our life at that point of time. Yeah, and we write big answers about what being empathetic is and blah blah blah, and we get good marks. All of us have done that, right?
Yes. Yes.
Yes, but however, what I realized about empathy is that there are two levels to empathy. There are two levels to empathy.
Sonal,
Yeah,
can you please mute yourself? I think you're, yeah, there.
thank you,
Thanks.
Sonal. So there are two levels of empathy that I have always kind of understood, and I have always believed in and experienced. One is the cognitive empathy, and one is the what I call as the spontaneous empathy. So one is I call understanding empathetically and experiencing empathy. One of the, I would say, the challenge of being a mental health professional is that there are many times you don't experience empathy. And if you don't experience empathy from any person in a therapeutic relationship, your empathy is always cognitive in nature. So, what does this mean? And I would just like to share a small example, my own experience in that, which is given in the book also. When you try to understand empathy at a cognitive level, these are some of the things that you start doing. You refrain from prescription. That is what an empathetic relationship is all about. That you refrain yourself from any prescription that you would like to give. You don't get into power dynamics. Okay, you don't get into power dynamics of how what is happening. I better than you better than you, but you actually allow yourself to listen. You are summarizing. So whenever the client has shared something, you summarize. You are trying to understand the context in which the client has undergone or the mentee is experiencing the particular incidents. You also refrain from moralizing. You value client experiences and you have the ability to discern. Now, when we understand empathy at a cognitive level, these are by default some of the things we at a very subconscious level or at a very unknown level work with. But when, as a mental health professional, you experience empathy in a relationship, especially a therapeutic relationship, in a mentor mentee relationship, your whole perspective, you do all these things, but beyond all these things, you also go through what I call as the 3 A's. You start acknowledging, accepting, and appreciating. And it is this 3 A's that becomes then your. So when you're acknowledging, you're listening, you're summarizing, you acknowledge what is happening to the client. And that's when you start the journey of empathy. You accept things as they are in the client's life. And that's when it stops you from refraining from prescription or moralizing. And you then start appreciating the client's abilities to deal with the situation. And then you see what role can you play, and you become the co-traveler in the journey of your client's challenges or the journey of your mentee's challenges. So just to give an example of how it shifted in me, as I said, I was undergoing this 5 days, 5 years of psychoanalysis and other things. There was a personal growth lab that I attended. And there was an intense discussion that had happened around gender, sexuality, blah, blah, blah. And people were sharing their experiences. One of the male member came forward and said how he feels women are unfair because apparently he had an incidents to share where a daughter-in-law, where a lady lost her husband in an accident, and the father-in-law wanted her to remarry within, I think, as soon as those 13 days rituals were over. And the whole world, and when he said the whole world, it didn't mean obviously the universe, but the community from which she belonged, which he was also part of, the neighborhood, felt that this girl was unfair because she refused and she would not respect and value the kindness, genuineness of this father-in-law's concern that she should get remarried. When I heard this, something deep in me just, did a somersault. And I became silent. I think it's important to understand that I'm a very talkative person. So my silence can become, when I go into silence, it becomes very deep silence. People have said my silence can be very, very fearful or threatening or whatever. So I became very silent for the first session when this was shared, which was around 90 minutes. When I entered into the second session, the facilitator of the second session just said, I am deeply concerned with your silence. That was one statement. He just looked at me as we sat down for the session. He just looked straight into my eyes and said, I am concerned about your silence. And it was this that kind of churned a huge set of feelings. And I started sharing how I felt it was unfair on the side of the community to not allow the woman to grieve, how this patriarchal system decides when we grieve and don't grieve. Why is it so important? It was just 13 days. And I went on and on and on. But I think what happened to me in that whole process was that I felt understood. I felt listened, even when I had not spoken, by my facilitator or by my mentor. He went on to become, he's no more now, but he went on to become one of my mentors with whom I went and did a lot of great work in marital therapies and other therapies. Learned a lot of things from him. As I said, the general things that I take, tips, techniques and all, but he had always had this greater, deeper philosophy that always touched. And it is from him that I started learning, and I learned one thing that stands out for me as empathy is articulating the unarticulated, saying the unsaid, because he said what I was not saying. And that became, for me, the emotional empathy experience. And today, I can actually go and start saying the unsaid of what my clients are saying. So I'm always listening to what they're saying, but I'm also experiencing and also sensing or also trying to understand what they are not saying. And this change happened once I personally experienced empathy in a powerful session. So it is important in a mentor-mentee relationship that as the relationship progresses, if the mentor is empathetic in nature, would actually go forward and give experiences of empathy to the mentee. But I again say, irrespective as mentors, whatever experiences we create for our mentee, it is the mentee who decides whether it was empathetic in nature and not. But still, we need to follow certain basic things. And for me, the 3 A's have always stood as a framework for me to get empathetic with my mentees, whether it's my clients in therapeutic interventions or whether it's my mentees, or even if it's my team members whom I train for whatever work that they need to do. The 3 A's have stood me in good stead, and that is what I would like to say. Yeah, the acknowledge, accept, and appreciate is something that has evolved after the book was released, and more work I'm doing on this framework now. And hence I'm bringing this to this forum for the first time. But yes, I would like to say that empathy needs to be looked at, emotional empathy and cognitive empathy. Cognitive empathy gives us tools and techniques, gives us do's and don'ts. But emotional empathy or experiencing empathy makes the empathetic relationship much more powerful and profound at both ends.
Yes, yes. Yeah, so such brilliant insights. Shobha, I think that's very nice. I think in a few words, you're packaging the whole transformational learning right here that's happening with us here right now. I think I would come to the last question now because we perhaps are coming towards the end of our time schedule. And yeah, I hope it's all right for us to continue for a bit. Um, I would like you to comment a little bit about how self definition can enhance a psychotherapist's growth.
Okay. Okay. So I think I've already spoken about that in my
That,
previous.
yes, yes.
Yes, I've already
Okay.
spoken. Yeah, the reaching of the unreached. How?
Yes.
Yeah. I think it's important. So I'll probably share another experience because I think when you define, uh, many times people have come and asked me, uh, is powerful dialogue scripted or is powerful dialogue, you know, and it's not a Bollywood or a Hollywood script that you need to write to make dialogues powerful, right? And in defining self, it becomes even more because there is nobody else scripting the dialogue for you. At least in a relationship, it is somebody who's scripting the dialogue for you. But in defining self, obviously there's nobody else. So what are your sources of different to get this powerful dialogue? And I have felt, for me, the major sources have been, quotes. I'm a very great fan of quotes. I like quotes, and there was a time, I think, as an adolescent, I used to collect a lot of quotes and these two-liners and all, and some of they kind of used to make a lot of sense to me and help me understand something. But one quote that has always stood in, which very initially in my career, I finished my MPhil in 1990 and went back to Rajasthan. And I was working in a school, they had just started a school, which was for a group of for mentally challenged, and we had children of all kinds, from spastic, because it was just started. People didn't know. I think it's difficult to visualize into 2020 what 1990 and 91 would be, but yeah, 30 years back, they were just trying to start this school. They had just taken up one or two special educators, and with the passion and intent, this group of trustees and philanthropists started this school. And I entered this school as a clinical psychologist. What was my job? Do IQ assessments, parental counseling, create IEPs, ITPs, blah, 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 coordinate with psychiatrists, neurologists, blah, blah, blah. Yes, job was interesting. I just learned fresh from NIMHANS. Nice to experiment, work in the scenario. But then I started looking, when I started interacting with the children at a very, in a lot of different scenarios, not just in the IQ assessment, in the setting, but during lunch breaks, during when I used to go into the classrooms, the way they would respond to me and they would connect to me, I realized. So one day I was standing and just watching all of them play, and it was supposed to be my observation time, as we call it, so that you see. But I realized that the children won't let me observe. They came tugging, they came, and when I saw them play, I said, like, do I really need to give them a diagnosis? Like, there's so much of beauty in this play. There is so much of innocence in this play. And even when I talk now, I get goosebumps. There's so much of innocence. There's so much of beauty. There is so much of peace in their play. That's so, they're uninhibited with what they want to do. And then this one was microcephaly, short, small guy, tugged at me and say, we had the habit of calling everybody Gigi. He said, Gigi, come play, Gigi, play, Gigi, play, Gigi, khel, Gigi, khel. And he pushed me and pulled me. And then I went into the group, and then we played for the next 1 hour, like nobody could play, And it is in that moment, something just turned inside me. And when I came back, my principal at that point of time had put a quote on the wall of Swami Vivekananda, which said, each soul is potentially divine. And it was just there. It was there from the day I had joined the school. But when I came back tired, sweating, Jodhpur, Rajasthan, you need to understand, tired, sweating, and just asked, to get me a glass of water to the person there. And I just sat there. And then my eyes fell on the quote and it just turned. I said, no. To do diagnosis is a qualification I have, is a responsibility that I have, but to understand is this quote, can I understand the divinity of the children? And I just changed my perspective. And trust me, when I changed my perspective, the microcephaly boy became a boy who could be like the assistant to many of us, because he was so cute, so nice, and he would listen to instructions, but then limited instructions. So he could actually just be one of our best volunteers. My hyperactive kid was so he was hyperactive, but my hyperactive kid was also the person whom I could rely on a lot of fast work to be done in the school. So when we had an event, he would be a what I would like to call the fast worker, but I could start looking beyond these diagnoses to their strengths, to their weaknesses, and how I can use their strength for their growth. And because it was the divinity, that innocence, that I started kind of connecting to them. So I still did my diagnosis because that was my role and responsibility. But then I started looking, my ITPs changed, my IEPs changed. So it was no more about telling them to write ABCD, but it was, or OIE, but it was more about learning life skills. And I think that was a transformational journey where I got into skill development, because skill development, I feel, is the only platform that helps us get in connecting to others' divinity. And that is the kind of journey that I've been taking about. And over a period of time, many of my clients have come back and said, we know you have a diagnosis in your head. You know, this is how they tell me. We know you have a diagnosis in your head. You never tell us that. Because I don't go and say you are this. The stamping and the labeling, I do not do. I create a facilitator. I say, great, I know there is a diagnosis. You know I have a diagnosis. So but I say, yeah, we trust you if you don't tell us the diagnosis, but if you tell us how we can overcome our suffering. I said, that's what matters the most. So I think for me, this change of, on that particular day, the summer day, that I did this play with a group of children, and then it transformed. So quotes and powerful experiences and its self-reflection can define. And I think it is very important for each mental health profession to define their philosophy of being a mental health professional, to define what they want to be going forward. And that can actually get you more clients. Trust me, we all think marketing can get us more clients. No, marketing, all freelancers, if any freelancers in this group, marketing does, yes, you need to make people aware of your services. Marketing does help. But you being yourself and changing your perspective and then making people know can actually change and get you more clients to work with also. So it's important that you also work on yourself. Yes.
It's so good to hear you say that, Shobha. I think it's very inspiring, and I actually find that I have a very similar strain of work that I've been doing, so I can hear the resonation of those those experiences in your words too. So, and that's really amazing. So I want to just maybe at the end of it, do you want to share a little bit on powerful dialogues mantra that you want to leave us with? Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So I have a very simple mantra that I would like to kind of take forward. I call it the model or the mantra of powerful dialogue. It is based on 3 pillars, but the first and the last pillar are the most powerful. Intent and hope. As a mental health professional, or as a person who wants to create powerful dialogues in the life of people for transformation, it is very important that you have your intent very, very clear. What is the experience I want to facilitate in this relationship, whether it's a therapeutic relationship or a mentor-mentee relationship? If your intent of providing that relation, the intent is very, very clear of what you want to facilitate an experience, I think it becomes, so I want to just ask, to get the clarity of your intent, these are some of the questions you should ask yourself when you get into this profession, or even when you're dealing with a client or when you're stuck. First and foremost is, what is my motive? Because see, it's very interesting that none of our parents want us to be mental health professionals. It's not a lucrative job in today's world, right? It's not a lucrative job. So,
yes.
And especially it was not a lucrative job when I studied psychology in 1982, where people did not even know, the spelling of psychology itself was so alien, and it was called psychology. And where Nimans, when you traveled in the bus, the conductor would say Huchar Aspatre, means the hospital of the mad people, that whoever wants, and they would actually say, and I will say it in Kannada and probably translate, Huchar Aspatre Goga or Ilibeku. Those who want to go to the madman's hospital should get down here. Which basically is that, and there would be that sarcastic smile. Now, those are the times that a group of us who probably would be mentors today, taking up mentorship, need to ask this question very clearly, and each one of us have to ask this question clearly. what is my motive to take up psychology? This is the first question I ask everybody. Because the second question is then, you have come here for your passion. And if you have come here for your passion and passion to change yourself or passion to change others, you need to be with it. You need to be with it. And that is one thing that will keep you moving all along. So, second question that you need to ask about your intent, is it to bring about change or assist in performance enhancement? It could be both ways. Like, am I here to bring in change, which is when then I'll probably deal with all the clinical things, or I'm here to assist performance enhancement, which means I'll become a trainer. Nothing wrong about it. But is your motive very clear? Is your intent very clear? This is something that I want to, the next two questions I think for me is very, very important. Am I merely also getting the satisfaction of elevating myself to high moral ground? Because I become moralizing, patronizing to other people. Or am I really genuinely interested in assisting the counselor or the mentee for myself? What is your intent? I have seen a lot of people get onto this high moral ground, right and wrong. I recently had, so this doctor that I was speaking with previously, in some other context, she had gone to another counselor and her husband had extramarital affairs, okay, 2 or 3 extramarital. He's also a doctor with the nurses. She had a crush on another doctor and both husband and wife openly spoke about it. And the husband were very upset and he took her to the counselor. And the counselor gave her a letdown. The level of moralizing by the counselor was so high. How can you do this? What nonsense is this? Like, are you a woman of character? Short of saying those 3 words. And she went into major depression. And then through some different ways, she reached out to me. And I'm now currently working with her in the last 1 week. And she's so depressed. And I'm kind of working on saying that it is not about you having a crush, but it is about something deep-rooted need that is getting fulfilled through this crush. And let's work through this. But first, let's deal with the depression and the anxiety that has got triggered. Am I this moralizing, patronizing person, or am I genuinely interested in it? And then finally, am I trying to prove a point and win an argument of feel superiors? Many times when you give a hypothesis to a client or a mentee, they disagree with you. They say, no, doctor, I don't think this is right. They say, ma'am, this is very wrong. I don't think I am like that. You are judging me. Yes, these are statements that will come because they are in the stage of resistance. If I can understand that and work with them rather than try to fool, but you know what? These are the data you have given. That's why I'm right. Then you have shifted to your ground. And finally, this is something much more deeper introspection required. Am I misusing my position of being in a position of power and of being trustworthy? We have had incidences of abuse by mental health professional like any other profession.
Yes.
But I think mental health professional needs to keep some level of boundary management, some level of, and you need to define your boundaries very well. It is not about should I take a gift from my clients or mentee, or should I not take a gift? Should I have a cup of coffee? Not have. These are very superficial transactional interactions that you have, but deep rooted, are you misusing the position of your power because you have authority on the other person? I've had parents who have come and asked me, my daughter is refusing to get married. I want you to brainwash for her to get married. They are already making their intent clear that misuse your position of power. And I said, that is the work I don't know. I always say, you know what, unfortunately, I'm very limited. I'm a defective piece sent by God that I cannot do this. You need to joke around it and make the point clear that you're not going to use your position of power to tell the girl to get married because the parents feel she needs to get married.
Yes. In fact, it may even take 2 to 3 sessions just to convince the parents that this is not my role. You know?
Yes. So you need to be firm. So these are some of the professional challenges that we face. But I think if the intent is clear of what you want, what is an experience you want to facilitate, then I think it makes more sense to kind of go back and, talk about it. So, and second thing I think is very, very important, that how do we create hope? To create a state that the possibility for things to change is in my hand. Our hand means it is in this relationship, it is in this interaction that there is hope, which is one of the basic foundation of any relationship. And that is when your therapy changes from therapy to therapeutic. This is how one of my mentee describes our relationship. She says, I'm not in therapy with you, I'm in a therapeutic relationship with you. Because every time I interact with you, I feel hope. So this is a shift from therapy to therapeutic relationship. And when therapeutic relationships become powerful, transformation is just like a default mode. You don't even have to worry about it. So
Yes.
I strongly feel that these are the questions, they are tough questions. Let me be very honest. You cannot answer them as 1 mark question or 50-mark questions, but these are quite deep rooted analysis that you have to do of your own self. But trust me, if you do this, I'm again saying this is not a marketing pitch, but you'll get more clients.
I think you're absolutely right. Absolutely right.
Yeah, so I think this is one thing that I would like all mental health professionals, and since it's coming from Charles Darwin, I felt this quote is one of the most powerful quotes in our journey, that we don't have to be strong, we don't have to be the most intelligent, but if you are the one who's most responsive to change, as we work with our mentees, as we work with our mentors, as we work with our clients, if you are responsive to change and adapt to a larger philosophy of life, then probably we can be the resources and catalyst for change in people's lives. So this quote of Charles Darwin stands out for me. As I said, I'm a great fan of quotes. So I always say I'm never the strongest, I'm never the intelligent, but yes, I can adapt. You want me to adapt, I will adapt. You give me time to adapt. And my clients then say, yes, if you can change for me, I will change for you. So,
Yes.
the
Yes.
transaction starts from there. Yes. So I would like to leave all the mental health professionals with this particular um, quote for them to ponder going forward. Yes.
So thank you, Shobha. This has been an absolute treat, especially for me and all our viewers. I'm thinking, I think the insights that you've shared, so few people talk about these things, and it's very important that this conversation comes out in the open, so that other therapists and people, mental health professionals, students of psychology, know what they're doing and what they're heading for. So, in so many months, we've been talking about, having a platform for supervising other mental health professionals, because we get contacted by so many people to learn, what worked for us.
Yes.
So, both Shobha and I and some other professionals have been contemplating on
Yes.
starting a platform wherein we can provide professional supervision. And Shobha has also suggested a very interesting thing to me, that from silence, we would be willing to have a short course on powerful dialogues, wherein maybe once or twice a month on Sundays, we could have a short training session that will be paid. In case you people are interested, you can let us know your thoughts on the group, and we can take it forward from there. And I also would like to inform you that that Shobha ma'am has also very willingly offered to us that she can share the soft copy of her book with people who are attending the webinar today. So those of you who would like to receive it, you can indicate your interest on on the group, the WhatsApp group that we've made. So thank you, Shobha. And I think my team members would like to give you a formal thanks. So
Okay.
let's just kick that in. Yeah.
Yeah, please. Thank you so much, Sudipta, for this.
Yeah.
Taking the initiative, basically.
Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to thank everyone who joined our webinar on Powerful Dialogues. We hope it was helpful as well. I hope we all have enjoyed the session. I would really like to give a big thanks to Shobha ma'am for providing her such a valuable time for us. It was great pleasure for all of us to get such an immense knowledge from you, ma'am. I would really like to thank Sudipta ma'am for providing us with such a platform where we get so much of knowledge. I would like to thank everyone who have participated in this webinar, because their coordination is equally important for us. For making this successful, for making this webinar so successful, I would like to thank everyone. A very big thank you to Shobha ma'am, Sudipta ma'am, and everyone who have been the part of this webinar. Thanks a lot, ma'am, for providing such an insight to everyone. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thank you and namaste to all of you.
Namaste, Shobha. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sudipta ma'am, and thank you, Shobha ji. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes. I think we didn't have as many viewers as we thought we could because about 75, around 70 registered, but in this session.
Okay, you
we
can stop
probably
the
had-
recording. Swati, you can stop the recording.
Yes, yes.